Well, as I was just reviewing with you a moment ago, building has been very much on our minds this year, and rightly so. But to whom does the responsibility of building the church belong? We read in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter number 16 these words. Let's click through a couple slides and let's go to this one. Thank you. Matthew 16, verse 18, Jesus said, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." You've probably heard those verses a time or two before if you've been associated with the church. Obviously, the passage says that Christ is the chief builder, but he promises Peter that he will build the church. But I have a question for you today. Would you think with me to start? Did Jesus Christ intend for us to stay out of the way? Are we to let him do all the work of building the church? I'm not disputing that Jesus is the head of the church. I'm not disputing that he's the foundation and the chief cornerstone. No problems there. However, there really is a difference of opinion about how much the people are involved in the building of the work. And it might have something to do with the word rock in this verse. Upon this rock. What is the rock upon which Christ said, "I will build my church"? Let's talk about the rock for a minute. There are three main interpretations of what the word rock means in verse 18. I'm not denying that there are others. I'm giving you the main ones, all right? The main ones are this. The first one is Peter. Peter, his Greek name is Petros. It means a stone or smaller stone that's hewn off of the bigger part of rock. The Petra, or the rock in verse 18 is Petra, Petros. And so we believe, or those who hold this position believe, that Jesus is giving a play on words. Peter is a little rock off the bedrock upon which Christ is going to build his church. Now, this is what the Catholic Church has long taught, that Peter was the first bishop in Rome, and that all papal authority and all church authority has passed through Peter, the first pope, down to every pope since, because Christ said, upon this rock, that's Peter, the church would be built. The second opinion among people about the rock is that it's not really Peter himself. There is a little play on words here, but it's really Peter's confession, because back in verse 16, if you're looking at that in your text, Jesus is asking, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter says, "Thou art the Christ," or the Mashiach, the anointed one promised in the Old Testament, the Son of the living God. So, and it's true that Jesus would soon ascend to heaven, and he would leave the responsibility to his 11 apostles. Judas, of course, betrayed him. 11 apostles who would declare by their confession and their preaching that Jesus died and rose again. And that confession is upon which the church is built. And who can deny that? On Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches the first message and the church is born and 3,000 are saved, all right? So there's an argument that the rock represents Peter's confession, and by extension, not just Peter, but each of the apostles who preach like Peter. The third interpretation of the word rock is that Jesus is the rock. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I believe it is verse 2, there was a rock that followed them, and that rock is Christ, that followed the Old Testament Israelites through the wilderness. So Jesus is the rock. And of course, the New Testament says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse number 11, that Jesus, other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Christ. Christ is the foundation. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20, he's called, I believe, there the chief cornerstone. So which one of these, Peter's confession, or Jesus, is it? Well, the truth is, there's a little bit of truth in all of them, right? Petros means rock. Was Peter's confession essential to the building of the church? Acts chapter 2, absolutely. Is Jesus the rock of Scripture? Absolutely. So which one is it? Well, I believe the natural reading of the text, and I've done some study on that this week and at other times in my ministry as well, that Jesus is really working the play on words between Petros, Peter's name, Petra, bedrock, and that Peter is the builder of the church. But I'm not conceding anything to the Catholic Church at this point. I don't believe that authority or the strength passed through Peter down through any group of people or any particular church to the modern day. But I believe Peter is the rock that Jesus is after. I'm going to build my church. Now, is it Peter particularly? I don't know. I kind of like the confession one, number 2, a little bit better, that it's Peter's confession. But the point is that Peter said something upon which Jesus could build his church. But I've got to the point I wanted to get. Christ said, I'm going to build my church, and it's going to involve Peter or Peter's confession. In other words, Jesus isn't going to do all the building. He's going to use men to do it, at least Peter and probably the other apostles. Now, it may seem like I've taken a long way around the barn to get to that point. But I am trying to debunk the idea that the church is solely Jesus to build. You and I and every believer partners with the Lord to get the job done, which is why I've put up 1 Corinthians 3:9, which just comes a few verses before the verse we read, the other foundation can no man lay, which is laid, which is Christ. That's verse 11, right before that. But we are laborers together with God. That's the point. We labor with God. It isn't just Jesus and God who build the church. We work with Him. In fact, that's reinforced by the verse that I read a little bit ago, Matthew 16:19. I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Who's He going to give? Well, this is the second phrase. In verse 18, He says, I will build my church. The second phrase, I will give unto thee the keys of heaven. What did He mean by that? Keys are something you use to do what? Open doors or gain access to something. So Jesus was putting into the hands of Peter and the other apostles the ability to open the door to the kingdom of heaven so that people could gain access. Now, that doesn't mean that we determine who gets in and who doesn't. We just open the door, like we open the door to church. Anybody who wants to come in, they can come in. And they're going to hear about Christ here. They're going to hear about Jesus here and the fact that He's the only way to heaven. So we're going to open the door, but it's up to them to decide, and it's up to Jesus to decide at the end whether they meet the qualifications. So we don't have the authority to determine people's eternal welfare, but we have the opportunity to open up the door. I'm saying all that now. I've come around again. We have a responsibility in the building of the church. It isn't just sit back and wait for Jesus to do the work. We must open the door. And hopefully we're doing that, and by our testimony, not keeping it shut. All right, well, since that is so, let's talk about how we could do a better job as a church to open the door or to build with the Lord. That's a long introduction. I just finished. Did you get it? What are we talking about? We're talking about I'm building with Jesus. I'm part of the rock upon which He's building through my testimony, opening doors to people who yet don't know Jesus. I had an appointment with a dentist. I'm sorry to have to tell you about this, but I occasionally do go see the dentist, even if I don't want to. When I set up my appointment with the dentist, immediately I got a text message to remind me of when the appointment that I just had set up was going to come. About 4 or 5 days before my appointment with the dentist, this happened just about 6-8 weeks ago, they sent me another text. Push C to confirm or something else to deny. I'm right, I'm okay, so I pushed the C. All right, I think I'm set, I'm booked, I'm hooked, I'm going to be at that dentist appointment. The day before, I get a call from the dentist's office, all right? And they and I was unable take it. I was in something else, and they left a message. We just call in to remind you that your appointment is tomorrow. And because they couldn't reach me by phone, they sent me another text to remind me that I had an appointment with the dentist the next. I think that borderlines on harassment. I don't know if I can file suit or not, but obviously they have a hard time getting people to show up for their appointments at the dentist. But then I come to church on Sunday morning and I look around and I'm missing some people. And I'm wondering, did they not put that appointment in their calendar? Did they somehow forget that they were supposed to meet with God today? And we read in the book of Hebrews, and are the slides not working, clicking? Could I get another? There we go. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. Now here's the point of the message. Did you know that one of the best ways that you can help build your church is simply by coming? This is the classic text on church attendance in the New Testament, but church attendance is not even commanded in the verse, it's just assumed. Where else am I going to be provoked, and where else am I going to provoke other Christians unto love and good works? It must involve the church. Now, provoke is kind of an interesting word here. Some of you might have stirred unto love and good works. Actually, it's the same word used in Acts chapter 17 when Paul goes into the city of Athens. He's a missionary. He's in Athens, a pagan city. They've got the Acropolis that's still part of it exists today. And he looks around at all these idols in Athens, and his heart is stirred within him, and he begins to preach the sermon at Mars Hill that some of you are familiar with to these pagans, inviting them to consider the God, the one that they don't know, the God, the unknown God. Thank you. But he's stirred. He's conflicted. The word means incited or even irritated. It has somewhat of a negative connotation. It almost doesn't seem to fit in a passage about love and good works. But we're supposed to be so incited or incentivized or irritated that we've got to get together and love on people and do good works to them. And I got to be passionate. That's the command in the verse here. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. And in order for this to happen, we must meet together regularly, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. So, 2 points today. They're parallel. We're trying to figure out how is it that I provoke or irritate people in a good way unto love and good works. Number one, I do not forsake assembly. Now, I deliberately chose to put the noun. It looks like in the passage, verse number 25, that not forsaking the assembling looks like it's a verb, but actually in the original, it's a noun. It's referring to a congregation or group of people. Don't forsake the congregation. Don't forsake the assembly. It's a noun in the original. So make sure you're getting together. So is there a requirement to meet? Letter A. Is there a requirement to meet? And I want to say right away in the passage, again, I'm repeating myself, it wasn't commanded. We're commanded to provoke unto love and good works. It's assumed that we will meet for assembly so that that happens. The point is, you can't love in a vacuum. I'm going to love in my bunker. I'm going to love in my closet. You don't do that. You love with other people in community. Love is the attitude, and good works are the actions that come out of an attitude of love. And if I'm going to do good works, I have to have somebody around me to do the good works too. I have to assemble for the purpose of love and good works. You know, this book, Hebrews, was written so some Christians who were struggling and beginning to turn back in the faith and fall away from Christ. And if they didn't meet together, if they didn't keep provoking unto love and good works, they would allow their circumstances to cause them to slip away from the church and perhaps from the faith too. I think that's interesting that actually comes up in the first century, because you might think that the first century Christians were all gung-ho for Jesus. They lived within a generation of the miracles. They talked with people who saw Jesus feed the 5,000. Some of those disciples saw Jesus walk on water. Boy, they got to be energized. But even in the first century, some were slipping away from church. And forsaking church might lead them to forsake Christ. And Paul, or whoever wrote the letter, is urging them, don't forsake assembly. You know, like exercise, and some of us do that. I know it doesn't show, but I do exercise. But once you stop exercising, it gets really hard to do it the next day. And if you let it slip another day, it gets even harder to get back to exercise. That is so true with church attendance, isn't it? Some of you have been saved for a while, and you know, once you miss 1 week and another, pretty soon it's hard to find your way back. So is there a requirement to me? Not exactly, but I can't keep the command to provoke unto love and good works if I'm not with other people to show love and good works. Letter B. Is there reluctance to meet among the people of God? And I think we can answer the question, yes. Why were these believers falling away? Why were they slipping? The text says, as the manner of some is, so some of these Jewish Christians were falling away. And we can't know exactly everything that was going on with them, but if you have your scriptures open, who's got Hebrews chapter 10 open up? We are looking at verses 24 and 25, but so let's get from the context. Why would these believers even be thinking about not showing up for church? What would go through a believer's mind? Wouldn't they need one another? Well, let's look down at verse number 33. It says, a gazing stock both by reproaches and afflictions. This verse suggests that they were already suffering and people were watching them being reproached and afflicted. The next verse, that is chapter 10. Let's just bring it up. I don't remember the verse. Thanks. Verse 34, they took joyfully the spoiling of your goods. Apparently, some people were even stealing some of their possessions. And finally, in chapter 12, verse 4, the scriptures mention, ye have not resisted unto blood, which suggests that maybe they were being physically attacked, not to the point of drawing blood yet, but it was getting physical. So maybe they were being ostracized by family. Maybe they were being persecuted, the second verse, by losing possessions, or finally by bodily harm. But honestly, the early church was not in a friendly environment. It was in a hostile environment. Any of you feel like that as a Christian today? In a hostile environment toward Christianity? Sure. Christians in that day were hated by the Jews. They were considered foolish by the Gentiles. And they were even beginning to be persecuted by the government. And how about us? Well, I really didn't get a good night of sleep. I don't think I can make it, Pastor. You know, I didn't really have a whole day with my family yet this week. So Sunday's family day. Well, Pastor, you know I can't miss the big game. I mean, this matchup it hasn't happened in 60 years. These are the two best teams. Or I couldn't get the kids moving this morning. We'll try harder next week, Pastor. I want you to think about who suffers the most, or just who suffers when you don't come to church. What's the answer here? The first one, obviously, is you suffer, because you are not bringing to the church the love and good works God expects you to bring. And your children suffer because they're like, well, it's kind of church optional. They're weighing decisions about their life and what they're going to do for the next 40 or 50 years, and they're watching you, and they're going to be affected if you don't come. Then you have your fellow members, church members are suffering because they're not receiving from you the good works that need to be done, and you're not getting from them the good works. And finally, your testimony in your community. You want to witness to somebody, you want to reach somebody, you want to invite them to church, but they know you live on their street and you only go. How important did you say this Jesus is to you after all? You think he's life and death and eternal life, and you go what? Twice a month? I don't think it ends up having a good testimony in the community. So all these relationships, I think, suffer when we don't attend church. During the COVID pandemic, church became hard for a lot of people, including us. We were asked to leave with a week's notice. So we're meeting in this room just as we are today, and we were given a phone call and said, you can meet this Sunday, but not the next. So for 10 weeks, we met exclusively online. You can imagine, I called all the church friends I knew, and the closest one I could find is a church buddy about 15, 20 minutes away said we could have an afternoon service. But it was really hard. Even pastors were afraid at that time. You might recall this. Nobody was quite sure what to do with the pandemic, and if we mix one group with another group and they touch our stuff and use our restrooms, what's going to happen? Well, even after we regained entry August 2021 to this building, our attendance was just kind of mediocre. I was glad to be back in the building, but it took a while for our people to come back and for visitors to start attending. And it was like slow going for a while. I'm thankful that it's picked up and we've recovered most of our absentees, but not all of them. Some families have not come back since the pandemic, and may never. And maybe God uses that just to kind of purge out the wheat from the tares. You remember that parable? And that might be a good thing. But the aftershocks of the pandemic is that it's a whole lot easier for people to do church in their minds on the couch. Back to our text, though, if you're to draw near to God, and if you're to hold fast to the faith, and if you're to provoke others unto love and good works, you can only do that in community. In other words, church isn't just about a sermon. I'm glad you like the sermon. I'm glad you come for the sermon. I'm glad you're here and you're listening to me right now. But church isn't just about the sermon. We have to see our brethren and greet them and sing next to them and pray with them and serve alongside of them. And it's the community, it's the fellowship, it's the contact with other believers that's encouraging me to stay faithful in the faith. Unless you do those other things, you really haven't done church. And just because you listen to somebody on YouTube or the radio, or you got your Jesus fix by a podcast, doesn't mean you've done church. It's not the same. Let me be a little more gentle with that. It's not the same to listen to a podcast or to YouTube your favorite preacher. Some of you figured out if you YouTube your favorite preacher, you can put him on 1.5 or 1.75 time and get done in half the time. If your preacher could preach that fast, then you'd be set. But church is more than a sermon. It's being with other believers and sharing community. And there's an element you cannot do on your couch. You have to be with other people. Even if you never grew up in Amish country, I bet you're familiar a little bit with a barn raising. You got hundreds of Amish will descend on a guy who's lost a barn in a fire, or he's just getting started out on his farm, and they all assemble. All the materials are there, and the people that know how to put the posts up do that, and somebody else is working on something. The ladies are busy cooking and making sure that the men have something to eat at lunchtime, and together they do a barn raising in a day. And from sun up till sundown, the last planks are being put on. And when they walk away that day, the guy's got a barn. That really is incredible how the community comes together to make the building work. And because they work together and use their expertise, they can get a whole lot more done in a day than that man could ever do in like a whole year himself. We need to think of church like a barn raising. You bring something and I bring something and she brings something, and together we all put our expertise in. And that means that what's going on here for an hour or an hour and a half is so much more multiplied in its impact because we can all do it together and barn raise for Jesus on Sunday. And that means when you don't show up, Somebody else has to figure out how the level works because they don't know, or the square works, or the saw works, or the hammer works because you're not here. If you want the barn to go up, if you want God's church to be strong, if you want to be part of the building, build my church, Jesus says, but you have to be a partner by coming to church. Number 2, the second part of the verse says, encourage one another daily. Notice verse 25 is split into 2 parts, and it's separated by the word but. Is that verse up? Verse 25, there we go. But, that's a coordinating conjunction. I learned that in English class a long time ago. That means it's separating 2 equal parts. It's contrasting the parts, but they're still equal. So equal to not forsake assembly is encourage one another daily, exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Exhort means, literally in the original, to come alongside or to encourage. It implies that believers must come alongside other believers to encourage them. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that we all have highs and lows. Seasons when we're feeling great and seasons when we're not doing so well. And we don't know if we want to keep going. And the Lord has given us a church family to help us through those seasons. Letter A here, encourage one another daily. We need to encourage others to meet. That's the encouragement that the writer is after. Primarily, we need to encourage one another to meet together. Why? So we can worship together. Why? So we can pray together. Why? So we can promote love and good works. For this to happen, Christians have to meet. Brothers and sisters have to get together. And when we do, we ought to be inspiring one another. So glad to see you. I'm glad you're here. I'm concerned for you, so that these fellow believers don't fall away. If you're not here, they may not be encouraged to stay true. You know, this is the work of every Christian. We do have an absentee secretary. I have secretaries, kind of part-time secretaries. So I got one working on the directory. I got another one who follows up with absentees, another one who prints bulletins, and I couldn't do it without these ladies who are doing things behind the scenes. But I want to ask you and encourage you about absenteeism. Is that the job of the pastor and the absentee secretary? Have you ever picked up the phone and called somebody and said, "Sister, I didn't see you Sunday. You doing okay? Did you come down with something? You sick? Can I pray for you?" You ever think to do that? Have you ever gone to see somebody that you haven't been able to reach by phone or seen in church for a couple weeks? Boy, I better run by their house, make sure I need to do a well visit check. If I can't reach them, man, I'm calling the police because I'm concerned about that brother. He might not be well. Have you thought about the brother or sister who's shut up due to health and cannot get out for services? Boy, I think they would love to hear from you on the phone and say, I'm thinking about you, sister. I know you can't get out right now because you've been through that surgery or you're on a walker or whatever, but I'm thinking of you and I'm praying for you. Would you like me to come by this Sunday and pick you up? I'd be happy to take you. Community, encouraging one another to meet. Here's another one. Encourage to meet more. The text does say, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. What day? The day is a technical term, especially in the Old Testament prophets, that refers to the future day of the Lord when the Christ, the Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah, appears. He not only returns, but he sets up his kingdom and he sets the ground level. That means he's going to judge men, and the high men and the low men. He's going to bring them all under the standard of justice. He's going to judge them. Some believe this particular day that the author is referring to is the coming day of judgment on Jerusalem. And this would have been on the threshold within about 6-7 years of when the book was written. Jerusalem was going to fall to the Romans, and maybe they already saw the handwriting on the wall for that. I'm not so sure, but either way, swift judgment coming from the Lord. So you need to do it more, Hebrews. You need to be in church more, Christians, now than you did before. Because the day, what day? The day of God's judgment or his return is fast approaching. You know, I'm thankful. I don't feel like we're under imminent judgment. Thankful for the protections of our country and our military and their service. But Jesus is coming. Jesus is coming. The Lord will descend from heaven with a shout. It will happen, and He will judge the earth. And we are on the cusp. I can tell you that we're closer than they were 2,000 years ago. I don't know if it's 10 years or 20 years or 200 years, but Jesus is coming. And I ought to do it more. What? I ought to encourage people to meet with God more right now, not less. Let me come at this another way. Do you need encouragement? I don't know about you. I need encouragement. You encourage me just by coming. And some of you actually say nice things about me, and that helps a little bit more. But could you use some more encouragement in our day? You frustrated by inflation? Migrant crime? School shootings? Broken or troubled marriages? Wayward teenagers? Shouldn't you meet them more? Doesn't your family need God more right now than it did before? Shouldn't you be coming more? Well, maybe you're thinking, Pastor, that's really nice. I really appreciate your teaching, and that we really make an effort to be here on Sunday mornings. Once a week? Let's consider the once a week mentality for just a moment. I ate a meal. I'm good for at least a week. I took a bath last Saturday, probably good for a week. I worked last Friday. My boss will understand if I don't come on Monday, right? Once a week. I told my wife I loved her yesterday. That should last at least a week. Church, once a week. Surely some things deserve a little bit more attention than once a week. Let me introduce you to another group of people that you could help me, because I'm going to spin the application a different direction. I want to introduce you to people I pray for almost every day, and their names are the unchurched. Now, when I mean unchurched, I'm not talking about just the people who are out there that don't go to church, and that's a whole category, but that's not the category I'm talking about. I'm talking about genuine believers who have been converted, and as far as we can tell, they're born again. They just don't go anymore. You have people in your family like that. You have friends like that. They used to go. No more. Something's happened. I actually pray that God will put me on their path so that I can encourage them to meet with God and come to church. You and I could be involved in inviting them to do what this passage is saying, to assemble themselves together and encourage them to do it. Guess what? I think this is one of our projects. We ought to have a project for the unchurched to reach them and get them back in the doors. That you could carry tracts with you, invite them to come to ours. I believe there are a number of Christians out there, for one reason or another, family, feud with the pastor, difficult experience, that we could help reconnect with the church if we would just invite them to come, if we were ready. Folks, Jesus is building His church. It's His job. But we are laborers together with God. And we can help build as a partner simply by coming and inviting others to do the same. I'm going to finish with a story that appeared in the Nashville Banner, a paper, some years ago. It was about an 81-year-old woman named Ella Craig. She had perfect attendance in Sunday school for 20 years. Now let's count that up. That's 1,040 Sundays without missing. The article that wrote up her milestone asked these questions. I think they were a little bit ornery that day. Listen. Doesn't Mrs. Craig ever have company on Sunday to keep her away from church? Doesn't she ever have headaches, colds, nervous spells, or tired feelings? Doesn't she ever take a weekend trip anywhere? Doesn't she ever sleep late on Sunday morning? Does it ever rain or snow in Ella Craig's town? Doesn't she ever get her feelings hurt by someone else at church? The article concluded by asking, "What's the matter with Mrs. Craig?" I'd like to answer that. Nothing at all. She understands that coming to church is a good thing. May I understand that too. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, thank you for helping us to review an important truth in the Word, and not just for our own benefit, but seeing how it could be instrumental in building your church. Lord, we're